Seems so far away.
Sorry,
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the final panel session. Good to see you all sticking around. Are you still all energetic and enthusiastic? That group is. We like them. Who can do better? Are we still all energetic and enthusiastic? Love it. Let's keep that going for the next hour. I know it has been a big 2 days. There has been a huge amount of information to take in. Hopefully it's been stimulating your thought processes. You've got a ton of new knowledge to take back to your organisations afterwards. I'm not going to say we're saving the best for last because we haven't actually delivered on that yet, and I don't want to set the bar too high, but I'm certainly excited about what we have to offer today. So for those of you who weren't in the session that I chaired this morning, my name is Brad Howarth. I will be your moderator for this panel session where we are here to discuss AI for social and environmental good. So let me be very clear, if you thought you were here for the AI for social and environmental evil panel, you are at the wrong event. Everything we're going to be talking about here now is about the positive, wonderful things that AI is doing out into the world. So my group of scientists here who will be doing that work for me, I just have to ask the questions. They're the ones who do all the heavy lifting, which is good. We'll be discussing how AI is already achieving impact as a force for social and environmental good, from predicting the climate in coming decades and using AI to better understand how and why droughts occur, to identifying the gene that causes motor neuron disease. My panel will discuss the fascinating possibilities and outcomes already emerging as a result of AI research at the National Science Agency across climate, health, energy, agriculture, and biosecurity. Like I said, I don't know very much about any of this, which is why I'm so grateful that you are all here. So let me tell you a little bit about my panellists. At the far end, we have Dr. Terry O'Kane, the Principal Research Scientist in the CSIRO Climate Science Centre. Yep, good. Terry's applying machine learning in climate science to understand future climates and how and why extreme events like droughts occur. Associate Professor Denis Bauer is a Principal Research Scientist in the CSIRO eHealth Research Program. She applies machine learning in biomedical research to understand the origins of disease and help develop fundamentally new treatment regimens such as gene therapy. Then we have Dr. Tim Finnigan, is the Director of CSIRO Energy and an advocate for the increased use of digital simulations in energy networks and the use of AI to optimise energy resources across the network. Then we have Dr. Jen Taylor, Deputy and Science Director for Agriculture and Food at CSIRO, who leads a research group using genomic and computational science for improved crop performance. And then finally, next to me, Dr. Simon Barry, Acting Director for CSIRO's Data61, previously also Research Director of the Analytics and Decision Sciences Research Program. I feel like quite a fraud. I'm the only one who's not a doctor. And probably never will be either. All right, let's dive into it. So maybe it's a good opportunity perhaps to tell us a little bit about some of the work that you're doing. So maybe, Denis, I might start with you. If you can talk a little bit perhaps about the work you're doing in using machine learning in genomics, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, and hi, everyone. So my research group focuses on using machine learning to understand the secrets that are hidden in the genome. You see, the genome really holds a blueprint for every single cell and organ in our body, and as such, holds vast amount of information about our future disease risks and the way that, the mechanisms that keep us healthy. So from that perspective, understanding all of this is really exciting, and I'm really passionate about doing this. But at the same time, it's also quite daunting. There are 3 billion letters in the genome, and every single one of them could be potentially contributing to disease. So for example, one misspelling in the genome can cause life-threatening diseases like Huntington's or ALS. Therefore, understanding all of this is not an eyeballing or a statistics mechanism anymore, but really needs sophisticated machine learning. And I hope to share that with you today.
Right. Now, Terry, I live in Melbourne, and it's hard enough for the Bureau of Meteorology to tell me what's going to be happening tomorrow, let alone 10 years from now. So tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing then using artificial intelligence and machine learning to model climate when we're looking forward over periods of decades.
Yeah, so it really is blue sky research.
That was pun intended?
No. Well, yes. But we do two things. We try to reconstruct the climate over the last 60 years. That's, we think we can go back and have sufficient atmospheric or estimates of atmospheric observations going back that far. Because it's we have a paucity of ocean observations, we can really only get a reasonable estimate of the ocean from 2004 onwards, where the Argo profiling arrays came into play. And so it's highly uncertain, so we treat this in a probabilistic sense. So rather than one estimate of the climate from, say, 1960 to present, we treat it as an ensemble. So we have 100 realisations of this to try and get some estimate of the uncertainty in what we think the climate over the past several decades was. And we use that information to then run that same set of models forward into the future and again try to ascertain some estimates of the uncertainty and also have, if you like, a four-dimensional probabilistic estimate of what the current climate is and what we think it will be. So where ML, machine learning, comes into play, we have these vast data sets. We really want to reduce it down to just what are the, the important causal relationships between, the various modes that live within the climate system. So that's our approach.
Jen, I imagine that a lot of this would probably tie somewhat to the work that you're doing, given you're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to look at how crops are adapting to climate. So tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and how you're going about trying to understand these changes.
Yeah, sure. So in agriculture and food, we're using machine learning and AI really to make decisions, and often they're decisions, multiple decisions in a single day, to understand quite a complex system about how our food and fibre is grown. So it's something I guess we all take for granted, that we can get food and we can get clothes and we can get building materials and things like that. But if you think about it, it's actually a very complex system. So what we need to understand to do that successfully is we need to understand the environment that that thing is growing in. So we need to, say, take wheat for an example. We've already heard from Denis that wheat has its own genome and any single misspelling can cause disease. That wheat grows in soil, and a single gram of soil can contain up to 1 billion different taxa of microbes that do or do not help that wheat plant grow. And then you've got climate. So we've heard from Terry that, climate is incredibly blue sky, and thinking about how can do that. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a wheat farmer, they've got to make a decision in April when they sow that wheat plant about what its future is going to be. If they've sowed it too late and there's not enough rain to help it establish, then they lose. And they are betting the farm sometimes. They lose that crop. If they sow it too early or late, then they risk frost in like 5 or 6 months' time. Can you tell me when the frost is going to hit? So they could lose the crop to frost. So they've got to weigh up those decisions and balance that whole system. And the reason I really find that fascinating is that unlike ever before, we've had so much data about climate, soil, plants, organisms, everything like that to help them figure this out. And we really need sort of complex systems to help us work on that. But the other fascinating thing I find about it is we've been doing agriculture for thousands of years. It's one of the first things humans did together, other than maybe dancing, Simon. But they...
I'm not sure where you're going to go with that. That's where it ended. Yep.
So I find it fascinating that we're still learning from this system. It's a very important system. We all need to eat. Yeah.
Tim, I guess the energy network is probably a little bit more modern by comparison to some of the systems that we're dealing with here. So how are you applying AI and ML, or how can they be applied in order to do things like give us a more secure and reliable energy network?
Yeah, thanks. Well, you would think it was more modern, but it's actually not quite as modern as we all might expect or hope it to be. One thing it's a large machine. So if you think of the electricity grid of Australia, it extends from the northern tip of Australia all the way down the east coast to the southern tip of Tasmania by way of the Bass Link cable and across to South Australia. Some have called it the biggest machine in the world. It really is one large single machine that has to operate as a perfectly orchestrated system. It doesn't always, so we're all aware of problems that it has faced. It's changing all the time. So the way that machine was built and planned in the 60s was from a small number of central power generation, coal-fired power generators, distributing electricity out to the end users at the consumption point. All that's been completely changed in the last few years. From a few dozen power sources to now over 2 million in the network, largely due to rooftop solar that's been added. And those rooftop solar systems are often controlled by smart inverters. So all of a sudden you've got, what we went from a small number of power generators to literally millions in the system, all trying to feed in and be controlled and balance this massive, some say the world's biggest machine in real time. And you would think it was more modern than it is, that it was all sort of somehow systematically automated. And if you've seen the Wizard of Oz movie, I'm sure everyone over the years has seen that, I kind of picture it as much more like the man at the end with the curtain and the levers, you're pulling the levers to get the system to work. And in some ways it's a bit like that still. It's, there's a fault in the line, or a lot of clouds coming over solar farms, and somebody's got to actually make a call to say, turn the coal plant up or down, or the gas plant on or off. Where machine learning comes in is we're starting to now put in place the frameworks for being able to simulate that massive machine digitally, heading towards a digital twin. That's some work that's started underway now. If we can get that set up and validated in the future, that opens the possibility to apply machine learning to this massive machine and resolve all these manual operations that it currently requires. So, big opportunity, that's one example.
So we've got 4 very big problems that are being tackled here using this technology. But Simon, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it, in terms of what we're seeing machine learning applied to. So can you tell us about a few of the programs that are also running within Data61 that are utilising this technology and where it's being put to good use?
Look, I think one of the opportunities for Data61 is that we actually work with all of the parts of CSIRO. So actually, a lot of the examples you've had there, Data61 is actually working in those places. So we're bringing that expertise there. I think machine learning, it has a major, it's a major opportunity for science, right? So science sort of has the conceptual. There's the conceptual side, which is we have gravity, you have concepts and I suppose processes, but you can also generate data, and you can actually learn directly from data. And as we get the ability to, as we get more data, we can use machine learning to almost learn directly. And the amazing thing about machine learning is it actually lets us generate data more efficiently. We can generate data from images, we can generate data from simulations, we can generate data in all sorts of different ways. So it's opening up amazing opportunities, in lots of places. Like, examples could be, in things like aircraft. Aircraft now, will have 50 systems in them that generate data all the time. Every second they're generating data about their state. But what does that actually say about the state of the whole aircraft, right? So how do you actually learn that? How do you actually deal with that in real time? If you get, in biosecurity, if there's an outbreak of a disease, if you find something in a certain place, what does that actually tell us about where it actually came from? Now, previously, you think that's quite hard. You think of all the possibilities about how something got somewhere. But if you have data about where trade goes to, you have data about where people look, where people don't look. You can actually use the power of computation to actually explore all of those scenarios. I think there's lots of places there's conceptual models of how the world works, but as we get data, they can be tested, right? So it's like we can accelerate science, and so there's a huge number of places that we're using it.
I like that idea of accelerating science, because we're really talking about doing things we could never do before, aren't we?
Yep.
So how far down the path have we got to? Because machine learning and AI is an evolving science in its own right. So in terms of the tools that we've built today to be applied to the problems that are being solved here, I mean, how much more capacity do we have with regard to developing the tools themselves to take the work that this group is doing even further?
Well, I think it is a very interesting question, because to some extent, learning and making inference from data, it's probably got 100 years tradition, and some of that is I suppose it's well established, whereas I think just in the last 10 years, the power of deep learning, which came from the use of neural nets, which were, I suppose, understood, from the 80s and the 90s, but, once you actually brought that together with technology from GPUs, graphical processing units, which are, basically coming out of the video gaming industry, that actually opened up whole new opportunities. And so the way technology intersects with new ideas, is amazing. So I think there is still a long way to go. Right, so our ability to learn autonomously, our ability to learn, through artificial intelligence.
I do feel gratified, though, just on that last statement, that all the time I've spent playing video games is actually helping to develop the artificial intelligence space. So
It's
nice
very-
to know that that was time well spent.
I would encourage you to continue with that. That's very
Good,
important.
thank you. Denis, I want to come back to something that we talked about in the opening, motor neuron disease. Now, this is obviously a critical illness that we need to be looking at. So how is the work that you're doing and the work of your colleagues helping to deal with a disease of that nature?
Yes, so ALS is the motor neuron disease that Stephen Hawking had, or that you might be familiar with from the Ice Bucket Challenge. And as such, it's a really heinous disease where within on average, the space of from diagnosis to death, there's only 2 years. And there's currently no treatment, certainly no cure. So therefore, we're part of the international consortium, the largest single disease consortium in the world due to the prominence of the disease, that really looks at what is the origin of this particular disease, which genes are involved, and how could we potentially find treatment or drugs that could treat this disease. And doing that requires an enormous amount of data. As I was saying, we have 3 billion letters in the genome. Each one of them could be contributing to the disease. Therefore, investigating which one truly is associated with that, we need to have the amount of samples that allows us to build a robust model. So the project mine has 22,000 individuals, which is staggering. So therefore, the resulting matrix of 22,000 times 80 million features that comes from, on average, there are 2 million differences between you and the person sitting next to you. So therefore, on a cohort of 22,000, that averages out to 80 million. So 80 million times 22,000, that's 1.7 trillion data points. And any machine learning, current or in the past, is not designed for actually dealing with that. So therefore now, for the first time, we've built, because we are thrust at the forefront of this, we had to build our own machine learning model that deals with this ultra high dimensional data that others have not dealt with before. So for example, the Googles and the Yahoos of the world, they typically deal with tens of thousands of features, whereas 80 million, that's to the order of magnitude larger than that. So therefore, it's nice to know that a little Australian team is at the forefront of big data analysis.
Cool. So Terry, the climate, an incredibly complicated system that we seem to be still learning about every day in terms of the complexities and how things interoperate. So how far down the path have you got then with regard to building solid and reliable models? And can you see a pathway ahead that takes you to something that will progressively get better over time?
Yeah, so the difference between doing a climate forecast and a weather forecast is that a weather forecast, you're taking a lot of observations now, you're synthesizing them into a model, assimilating them, and then you're running forward for a relatively short period of time. So the inherent biases or model errors don't have time, those errors grow slower than the errors in the initial conditions, the uncertainty in the observations. In the climate forecasting space, we have a paucity of observations because we really rely on knowing the ocean very well and at reasonable resolution, and we don't have observations at depth in the ocean. And then we're running the model forward for up to a decade. So the inherent errors in the model manifest relatively quickly within that forecast, and they're the real problems with how we forecast. So you become very aware of the limitations of your model. So one of the approaches that we take is to generate very large data sets and then try to use machine learning to pull out what are the, if you like, the relevant mechanisms within that probability distribution and then verify them against what observations that we have from history. So it's a difficult problem. We also, the other complicating factor is we actually don't really know the dynamics that drive the major climate teleconnection modes. So if you think of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which drives a lot of the large-scale weather in Australia, its relation to something like the Indonesian dipole, the causal relationships between these large teleconnections, we only really know them empirically. So machine learning offers a tool to try and do a purely data-driven approach to pull out and mathematically underpin those relationships.
Tim, you're talking about modelling this huge machine that you described and the notion of building a digital twin, so I guess trying to replicate the physical world in the virtual world. If you can build that capability, what will it enable the energy industry to actually do? How will we benefit from having that digital model in place?
Well, one thing is to avoid overinvestment in the future grid. So there's a lot of discussion about what the national electricity grid will look like in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, given that it was designed decades ago for a different purpose. So once we start looking at the distribution of energy sources in that grid, and again, I said before, we had a dozen or two central generators in the past, and now we have millions. So coal is still there, gas, solar, wind, rooftop solar, hydro. We're adding batteries, adding hydro storage, all kinds of different contributions into this network. This simulator will be able to help us decide where the poles and wires and transmission systems need to be placed in the future to optimize that system without overinvesting, without gold plating, as they call it, which has happened before. Without clear view of the future, we just say, well, there could be a lot of solar farms out there because it's sunny. Let's put a whole lot of power transmission lines in now to enable that, only to find out that dynamically that's not the best situation. So it will avoid overinvestment, and that can be in the billions in savings. That's just one benefit. There's a number of others. So in the situation where you have faults in the system or environmental impacts, for example, bushfires. So with climate change, we're expecting more and more intense bushfires, higher peak temperatures. How will a grid system in those environmental conditions operate in the future? And how can it potentially repair itself if it is integrated with some machine learning? If a fault goes out in a certain part of the grid, can machine learning help the system repair itself or reroute power so that we don't get a South Australia statewide blackout? We actually have a smart enough, well-trained grid that can figure out other pathways for power to flow. So there's a number of benefits to it.
Cool.
I can probably, and I suppose adding to that, we're doing work with New South Wales Transport where we're looking to build, building models, and a model is a digital twin, as a representation of the Sydney traffic system.
And so you're telling me you get to build model trains?
Well, model, yeah, that's that makes it sound even more.
Yeah.
But that's the same issue. So they're interested in understanding the system. They're interested in forecasting demand. They're interested in when something happens, understanding what has happened and how they can respond to it. And I think that's the opportunity, in many systems, is to find representations which are predictive, right? Because once you have that, they can actually be used as action. They're actionable.
Jen, you talked about helping farmers make better decisions. How far down the path have you actually got to delivering that information to farmers then? Are we at the point now where you're actually able to work with them directly in order to help guide them in terms of what their future plans will be?
Yeah, in some areas. So I think farmers have been working hard to get efficient in their practices for a while now, but there's a lot more urgency in the system. I think everything needs to get more efficient, more sustainable. So farmers need to make some fairly complex decisions about how they use their water, whether they need to worry about pests or pathogens and all that sort of stuff. And there are systems around that do that. I guess one example I'll point to is I guess the whole planet is thinking about what is the most efficient way to make protein. And that's something that we've been working on. And aquaculture in particular, I mean, I think as Genevieve said this morning, aquaculture is quite old in this country. But just recently, aquaculture and its sustainability credentials have been growing and growing and growing. So there's a booth outside that's been talking to how they help aquaculture farmers monitor the water quality in their pond, and then they can make sort of essentially almost instantaneous decisions about how to manage that system and prevent waste for their production system. So that's one example. Wouldn't have been able to do that without sensors and without a way to interpret that stream of data that's coming in. Yeah.
That's the exciting bit about this. I mean, we're not talking about machine learning and AI because it's just the latest tool. We're talking about being able to do things we could never actually do before, aren't we?
Yeah.
So I'd imagine, sorry, Simon, you?
I was going to say, so the agriculture one, I suppose the really exciting part about that is, a lot of the machinery within agriculture is now becoming, it generates data, right? So it generates what it's done, right? So if it adds fertilizer, it generates what it harvests. It knows where that happened. And so that's exciting in the sense you've now got data that you never had before. But the even more exciting part about that is actually the machines are programmable. So you can actually write programs to actually get the machines to do things. So you can actually run experiments on your farm in an automated way. And so your ability to learn about your property and your production system, it opens up in ways you've never had before. So that's a really interesting time.
There's a statistic now, a sort of 70% uptake of sort of unmanned tractors and things like that rolling around farms and making decisions about water, pests, pathogens without essentially a farmer walking up and down the field trying to make decisions about where chemicals go and things like that. It's just so much more precise and efficient, which is fantastic for the whole system.
Terry, I want to come back to you for a moment, maybe pop another couple of questions in before we go out to the audience. I understand you've done some fairly groundbreaking work when it comes to drought prediction as well. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think it's more that we've now understand how little we know about droughts. So I think drought's one of those words where everyone intuitively has a sense of what you think a drought is, but from a meteorological perspective, if you look back in the history of droughts, they're pretty different. And if you like, the large-scale drivers that set up the conditions for a particular drought at a particular location at a particular time can be quite disparate. So the work that we've been doing is to try and find, in a mechanistic sense, what are the common underlying drivers going back in time. So I wouldn't say that we've succeeded, but we have a better understanding of what we don't know.
Good.
Which is a lot.
One of the topics I'd like to get into then is how AI and machine learning is changing the research process itself for the better. Denis, I'm guessing the kind of work that you're doing, it just would not have been humanly possible to do this prior to having the tools available that you have now.
Yes, so genomic research typically in the past are very heavily statistics-based, where you look at each location in the genome independently and make some inferences of which should be involved in disease or not. But we know that complex diseases are multigenic diseases, so there will be multiple locations in the genome working together in order to create the disease. Therefore, you will never able to capture this on a full genome, 3 billion letters, on the full genome scale by using standard methodologies. Therefore, using machine learning, particularly what we're using is random forests that build sort of individual decision trees that look at subsets of the data and then ultimately come up with a model that captures the whole 3 billion letters of the genome and make that inference. So from that perspective, really understanding what the genome, and we're certainly not there yet, but we're on the path of understanding how the genome influences our disease risks. And what we know, though, is that almost everyone in the audience here will have one mutation or more that should be clinical actionable. So it could be a future disease risk, or it could be something relatively trivial of how quickly you metabolize a certain drug. And all of this should be readily available to your clinician and to you yourself in order to make the best decision around your healthcare. And all of this knowledge is currently not there, but with machine learning, we're slowly growing it.
Good. So I thought we might go out to the audience now because you've been very patiently sitting there and I wanted to give you an opportunity to be involved. Do we have a question? I can see a hand up there. If we can just bring the mic down. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you can just tell us who you are and where you are from, please.
Oh, 1, 2, you can hear that. Sorry, it's Stefan Wagner from Oz Industry. I'm just going to ask a question which is a little bit around ethics. Given that the great unwashed public have to trust data, and AI in and of itself is already a very complex scheme for the most in the public to understand, how do you then use AI to mitigate against where there's fraudulent activities in manipulating data? We've seen it happen in the automotive sector, we've seen it happen in pharmaceuticals. I'm sure there are other case examples where even scientists have manipulated data. So is there a chance here that this would actually give more confidence back to the rest of the public that the data can't be twisted and we can believe and engender that trust over the long term, okay?
That's a great question.
Look, I suppose I'll start. Like, so, look, I suppose science has got sort of at its foundation, the idea of peer review, and I think if you look at the history of the last 100 years of science, it is around, understanding the nexus between the data that you have and why that lets you tell something about the world, or let you make conclusions that are reasonable or have a level of confidence to them. Like I think from some of the ethical problems that you see in machine learning being used commercially is that people just take any data and do anything to it and then claim that it gives them certain answers. And so at least science itself, the science method has actually been very careful about that. I think actually on the other side, I think to some extent maybe science can become too religious about that in a certain sort of way. So it needs to be open about using the information that's available and how it does it. But I think at least in terms of your question, there is a set of there is pretty strong protocols within the profession, I suppose, to look at how you manage that. I don't know what other people do.
And also AI is about being able to deal with multiple independent sources of data at the one time. And so I've seen cases where in fact it's the reverse, where AI has picked up anomalies when looked as on its own perfectly reasonable, but when put in the environment and the whole data fabric, as we say, it just doesn't seem to fit. Now, as Simon says, there's a sense of judgment that has to, maybe there's something there. We're looking at complex systems, but also maybe something doesn't fit. So I've seen actually the opposite, where it's actually it's brought truth to the system when you look at it as a whole.
Yeah, I think that, and just adding that, at the end of the day, your data is the point of truth, right? It's the point of truth about the world, right? And to some extent, the power of AI is having large amounts of data, and so it does test our theories and our assumptions and our beliefs, right? And that's where learning comes from, I think. So.
Well, in our space, we can take very large high-dimensional data sets, use machine learning tools to generate some reduced order model, and then do predictions with it, and test whether we can predict a historical period.
Jen, I want to come back to you for just a second. I mean, the question, I guess, goes to that of trust in data. You're working with farmers, and farmers are often third, fourth, fifth generation, been on the land for a long time. How do you go about having that conversation where you're telling them, maybe that's the way you've been doing it, but the data says maybe you should do it this way instead?
Yeah, it's a very complex question, I think, because you're right, people have been doing this for a while, and often looking over the fence is what they trust. What their neighbours have been doing is what they trust. And also, I think we need to think very carefully about the question of data ownership. So I'm not necessarily going to go there. But I guess when you're talking about someone, you want them to change practices and various other things, you do have to build trust. The great thing about, I guess, being able to handle multiple streams of data, as I've said, is that you can essentially build in their knowledge and their contextual understanding and their lived experience. And once you do that, and as Terry said, you show that you can predict back in time, then it validates, to some sense, your predictions going forward in time. So the bit I really love about working in data is connecting people with data, and when you do that, then they start to trust themselves in the data. So it's about grounding it and respecting history to predict the future. That makes sense, yeah.
Good. Do we have another question out on the floor? Looking for a hand there? Go ahead, please.
Hi there. My name's Clement Young. I'm from New South Wales Government Department of Customer Service. I've got two questions around climate change. The first one is, what are we doing proactively to mitigate the risk of climate change with AI? Tim, you've talked about energy efficiency, balancing the load. That's all great measures, but can you elaborate on some examples that we can use AI to better address climate change risks? And the second one is around the energy consumption for increased computational power. I know that's kind of emergent field, and obviously with a lot of IoT as well as AI and increase of computer power, what's everyone's thoughts about that?
Who wants to grab that one? Tim, do you
Yeah,
want to
I didn't quite catch all of that, especially the second part, but I think the first part it didn't come through quite clearly, but the first part was around climate change and despite the load balancing and automation of the grid, what are we actually doing to combat climate change in the electricity system? So one of the things is just integration of renewable energy into the grid. That's a massive challenge at the moment and a huge bottleneck to decreasing our emissions from the electricity system. Keep in mind, electricity is only about a third of the energy in Australia, so there's a lot of emissions and climate change impact from other parts of the energy sector as well, transport, industry, and our export energy sector as well. But in electricity, there is a backlog of large-scale wind and solar projects sitting on the fringe of the grid, waiting in a queue to get connected. And we just don't have enough capability in predicting and simulating and designing the grid system to accommodate that input. So that's one area. If we can work on that, we'll allow a quicker uptake of more renewables, which obviously would have a benefit for climate change. Also, the other side of it is not demanding the energy that we don't actually need, so energy efficiency. So the further we can go down to the micro scale inside the home, basically, and improve the distributed energy resources or the demand response at that scale, then we reduce the energy that actually has to be generated, and that'll drop emissions as well. So this digitalization of the whole system will have a net benefit in terms of combating climate change for Australia, our own impact. The second part of the question was sort of related to what I was just talking about, the residential scale.
No, it's more about increased power usage because of using AI and IoT devices. I mean, overall, I guess there might be an increased demand on energy.
Yes, that's a really interesting and growing topic at the moment. So for everyone here, it used to be you just had your manual power meter on your house and you got one data point every 3 months or so when the meter reader would come along and read the numbers, and that was it. But now with smart meters, you've got live real-time data, so literally hundreds of thousands of data points every minute. And what we're doing in CSIRO is what we can get from those meters is a real-time high sampling rate frequency and voltage signal. And with that, we're using machine learning techniques to disaggregate those frequency signals to work out what appliances inside the house are operating in which way. So by just looking at frequency and voltage, we can tell the washer went on or the air conditioner went on. And that's starting to build up a massive data set to teach us how consumers are actually behaving inside the home with their electricity use. That's a project called the National Energy Analytics Research Program. It's a $50 million project. D61, of course, is again involved in that with the energy market operator and the Department of Energy to get AI to really have a benefit. You need a lot of data, and so this is the start of it, is building up this massive data set right to the consumer level. So it's one thing we're doing there.
Terry, would I be right in thinking perhaps that some of the work you're doing could lead to, feed into planning processes, particularly with regard to infrastructure resilience?
Yeah, so I suppose here's the point where we differentiate between climate change and climate variability. So I think climate change is, we're reasonably good at that because it's really the forced response. And if you look at the IPCC projections, they pretty much match the large-scale observations. Where it gets difficult is when we start to talk about climate variability, say, over the next decade, 2 decades. And that's where we're in the climate forecasting space, where we're actually trying to predict the phase, if you like, of the relevant large scales within the climate system. And that's a difficult problem because, and this is really at the cutting edge of some of the machine learning methods that we're applying, because these phase transitions are really regime changes. And so one of the starkest ones that Australia went through was in the late 1970s, the warming and drying over Western Australia coincided with a shift in the mid-latitude jet. So these kinds of relatively fast changes in the jet structure, or if you like, the variability in the climate system, are very difficult to predict, but they can have very large consequences in the near-term climate. And so that's really these new machine learning tools that we're applying are giving us not just a deeper insight, but also a chance to try and extract these relatively weak but skillful predictive signals within our large data sets.
Right. Do we have another question out there? Just looking for hands up.
There's one over there.
Thanks. Jason Shima from IP Australia. I'm actually just wondering, you've mentioned various things like changing protein sources, for example, aquaculture, and there's been other talks about meat substitutes and things that have been performed. There's also talk here about the climate variability and long-term trends. Is anyone looking at who's farming what and where rather than just what they're doing on their farm?
Yeah, so I got some of that. So is anyone looking at
Who's farming what and where?
Oh, okay, yeah,
So
so land
are we
use.
growing things in the wrong place, maybe?
Are we growing the wrong crops? Are we, using water that we don't have to make rice, for example?
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, and I guess there's been a lot of discussions about how we might do this as a system, as a national system. Look, there are those sort of meta-level decisions sometimes made. Often it's market-driven. You can't run a non-profitable farm. Eventually resources will get to you, and our farmers are sort of... Yeah, exactly. There's no subsidies and there's no crop protection in this country, so you can't get away with it. But I think you're talking about sort of meta-level decisions, and look, I think the conversation in this country is really rapidly maturing in a very short timescale about how we deal with how agriculture and biodiversity can be allies, and how we use agriculture as a lever to actually improve our natural resources rather than just being seen as a sink for it. So yeah, that's a pretty ambitious conversation, but I think there's a lot of levers in the system to start making it happen. Obviously, water utilisation is going to be the major driver, discussions around that. So there are rapidly maturing conversations about it, but the key driver at the moment is the market driver, and there's some key sustainability signals. So you saw the alternate protein signal, as you mentioned. That's an example of a huge protein driver. Consumers are becoming increasingly aware and sensitive to, which is fantastic, to knowing more about, and I encourage everyone to learn more about how the food is produced. I think, it will drive the market in the right direction.
Good.
I suppose slightly tangential comments. I think some parts of agriculture are actually becoming more intensive. All of your tomatoes are grown, in greenhouses, and that's very strong automation. So we're using smaller amounts of land to generate, more food. And you're seeing, things happening in an urban side. Whereas I think you'll find other parts of Australia, if you travel in areas, you see, the expansion of almonds, right? So to some extent, there's specialisation in certain things. Cotton coming south.
The tomatoes are a really good example, because that's come from Sun-Drop Farms, a complete closed system, solar, water, they use salt water, completely closed system, and they do that for, it's a sustainability credential thing, but also it's a good economic decision for them, so that's a market driver, so that's, yeah.
I'll grab another question from the floor in a moment, but I want to insert one here myself. The topic we're talking about is the use of AI for good, but as we know, a lot of good intentions often get railroaded or derailed by malicious actors. How do you go about ensuring then that you don't lead to unintended consequences? One of the topics we've talked about is the connecting of sensors up into networks, therefore putting sensors onto equipment, but theoretically every piece of equipment we connect up now becomes connected potentially to a malicious actor. So how do we go about ensuring that the work that we're doing for good doesn't end up having consequences that we didn't plan for? Anyone want to have a go at that? Silence descends upon the panel.
I'll just make a comment. I'm not sure if it's if I can in any way ensure that we don't have unintended consequences. But again, with the grid system, if you automate that, and you're right that every internet router in someone's house becomes a target point for hackers to get into that system, and then that can proliferate. So in the planning for things like digital twin or potentially automating parts or all of the grid, national security, cybersecurity is the top line part of that whole planning and that process. I think it's just vigilance from the start in looking at the architecture and how everything will be set up, so that every step of the way it's protected. Otherwise, I actually don't have an answer for how you make it foolproof, so you absolutely ensure that there's no risk.
So I suppose in D61, we've got a whole a program or a group around cybersecurity sort of research, and we do work. I think, say, medical devices. I think we've done stuff in quite particular devices. So I suppose it comes down to the sort of hazard that the hazard assessment that people need to take. In terms of, for this device, what are the risks? What are the risks around that? But I think, as we all know, it's becoming more complex. And then the risks are becoming different. So I think people need to keep revisiting what those things are. In terms of our actual science, I suppose you always have to be assessing, what's the ethical basis of the things we do, right? So if we do research, that involves human subjects, and it might even be just to interview them, right? That actually gets approved by a panel, right? So there is oversight over that. But I think, the important part of the question is, the landscape is changing. The things we do are changing. So is our our conceptual basis for why we think it's safe still good enough? And so we've got to keep working on that.
Well, to quote Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, I suppose. So, all right, do we have another question out on the floor? We might just grab one more before we start to wrap up. I can't see very well from here. Do we have anyone with a hand up? No? All right, I'm going to put another one of my own in then.
I might just add to the last point, if that's all right. So I was just thinking, with the great power comes great responsibility. But the thing that I really like about some of the AI conversations, particularly the ones I've had in CSIRO, is technology adoption, and just the realisation that we actually do have to sort of understand how the technology is adopted. So in the farmer case, you actually do have to go on farm and talk to them about, if we develop this, will you use it? And some of the answers are surprising, what they're thinking and how they will use it and what that will mean. And I think that the fact that we do that now, that technology adoption question happens, I think it really informs some of the things that's on, but we do need to think through. But that's the data that we're using to think that through. Yeah.
Cool. So a lot of what we're talking about here, I guess, is using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us work with incredibly complicated data sets and reach findings and conclusions from that. Often, though, when people talk about AI, they're thinking about the notion of a fully autonomous system. So how far away are we from actually starting to put more autonomous technologies into play in some of the areas that you're working in?
Well, sorry, I'll take this one.
Go ahead.
So I often hear, the analogy, or there is a continuum, that machine learning, the next one is AI, and then there's fully generalized artificial intelligence. Think of, Terminator charging in. And I don't think that's a continuum that really is a realistic way of looking at it. Like AI or machine learning is not the poor cousin of AI. It's horses for courses, right? The question is, can a certain technology answer the question that you have? If yes, then good. If no, then let's invent and come up with new technologies. So therefore, I don't think it's the goal of going to a fully autonomous system in any capacity if there's no purpose around it, if the current technology can already answer the question that we have.
So we are at the dawn of the AI era, so to speak. We're very quickly moving down a pathway of utilising these technologies, but there's still so much more that can be done that we haven't explored yet. What are you most excited about? If you look forward over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of the capabilities that are likely to be delivered to you, what really gets your blood pumping around that?
For me, the most
Denis? Yeah.
For me, the most exciting thing is that we will have so much data in different disciplines that we can actually link together. So for example, CSIRO is part of the MRFF-funded Outbreak Consortium, which looks at antimicrobial resistance and the rise thereof and how we can be protecting ourselves. Because antimicrobial resistance is going to be one of the largest challenges that we're going to face going forward, because it will mean that if our current drugs are not effective anymore, then effectively any surgery could be a death sentence, any graze or cut could be a death sentence, or any infection could be a death sentence. So this is something that as a society, as a community, we need to come together and really address that problem. And I think data, education, and technology will be the answer around that.
Terry, what about for you then, in terms of the complexity of the system that you're working with? What will you be able to do 5 years from now that you can't do today?
So I think the exciting thing is that AI and machine learning relies on a high quality continuous stream of data coming in. And we've had that for atmospheric observations for a few decades now, since the late 70s with the satellite period. And oceanography is moving into a new phase where we do currently have a pretty good coverage for the first time of the upper 1,000 metres of the global ocean. There's new profiles coming on board that will take that down to about 2,000 metres. And it's really this information in the subsurface ocean that's the key to understanding the predictability in the climate system.
Jen, what about for you then? If you think about the work you're doing with Australian farmers today, what will you be able to do for them 3 to 5 years from now that you can't do today as a result of your capabilities in AI and ML?
Yeah, well, I guess 2 things. One is understanding the system they're operating in much better and really inform their decisions so they can just generate value for their communities, for their regional communities, and that's what really this is about for me. Bring that value back on, making those decisions that really capture that value, that are good for them, are good for the planet, and are good for what we need as a society to feed ourselves. I think that's really important. We've got no choice in that. So I think making those decisions as informed as possible with that quadruple bottom line is just really exciting that we can do that now. The second thing that excites me about AI and machine learning is when I think about these technologies globally and what they can do, it's about unlocking creativity to me. You know, if I think of a farmer that's no longer spending 4 days driving a tractor around the field, then what they're doing is actually using their brain. And I'm excited about that you know, that they're freed up to do much more creative, interesting, human-type activities.
I kind of like the idea of driving a tractor, but I've never done it, so what would I know?
It wears out.
Wears out pretty quickly? Got it. Tim, what about for you then? I'm kind of getting the sense that if we don't start utilising these tools, we may not have a robust and reliable energy grid moving forward. Would it be right to think that?
Yeah, it'd be right, yeah. And it's not a secret. I think I'll move away from the national grid, but it is truth that it's not, the tools we have in place now are not fit for purpose in actually managing that system going forward. It's a bit fragile, to put it that way. So, not that AI is going to solve that overnight, but digitalization, simulation tools, better predictability through models is important in the near term. Other things I think we'll see coming on in energy are just optimization on distributed energy systems. So if you go right out to the other scale where we've got wind or solar, being able to predict those better to manage the flow into the network. And I'll use an example from CSIRO. We're just commercializing a technology for cloud solar forecasting. So this is you set out an array of cameras pointing up at the sky and all oriented in a specific way. And it can be over quite a large scale, say a city scale. And these obviously take pictures at high frequency and high resolution. And all that data is integrated using machine learning methods to provide a very comprehensive picture and forecast of the solar irradiance coming through in the near term. And that allows solar to be able to predict or to feed into the market at a better price and be more competitive. So it's that type of thing as we move to more clean energy sources, you know, just coming up with AI or machine learning driven enablers to allow them to compete better in that market. So.
Good. Well, that brings us to time. Actually, we're just slightly over time, so I guess it's probably appropriate for me to now ask everyone in the audience to please Thank my panellists for this afternoon. It's been a fantastic discussion. And we're all going to exit the stage, but I'm going to leave Simon here because he's going to have the final word for the day. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for listening. Panellists, if you'd like to join me off stage, Simon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.